Hello, my name is Yanni Aviles, and I am a programming officer here at NYC DORIS, the New York City Department of Records and Information Services. I am just going to give you a little run through, a little housekeeping. So I will introduce who will have some opening remarks, and then she will introduce the Assistant Commissioner, Kenneth Cobb, who will then introduce Molly, who's sitting right there. So this is a collaboration between City Lore, Artists Alliance, Inc., and the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, DORIS. So we will be streaming live on Zoom. If you want to pop questions in the chat, you can at the end of the panel discussion, which will last about 50 minutes. We'll be taking questions from the in-person audience and from the virtual audience. So keep a lookout for that. So right now I will introduce Commissioner Bull. Thanks.
All right. Well, we have a few glitches as we begin to, do more in-person programming here at the agency, and thank you to those who came and are sitting in the audience, and those who are online watching. And please do send in questions. It's a pleasure to begin to sort of reopen both for research, as these people all have done research at the archives, and you'll be hearing about that today. We are the home of New York City government's historical records. Some people think are very boring, really not, because they tell the history not just of government decisions, but about people's lives in the city. So I want to introduce Assistant Commissioner Ken Cobb, who has been associated with the New York City Municipal Archives and the Department of Records and Information Services for more than 42 years. He was introduced to the archives as an intern in a program sponsored by American History Professor Emeritus from Columbia University, Ken Jackson. A graduate of the University of Albany and a recipient of a Master's in American History from Columbia University, Ken served as the director of the Municipal Archives from 1990 to 2005, when he was appointed Assistant Commissioner at DORIS, where he continues to lead. The Municipal Archives is one of the largest archival repositories in North America, housing more than 225,000 cubic feet of world-class historical records dating back to the 1600s. Most recently, Ken led the effort to digitize more than 10 million birth, death, and marriage records and make them available to the public online at no cost. Ken has guided dozens of authors whose notable works describe various aspects of New York City history, ranging across period and time. In addition, thousands of family historians have benefited from his assistance. It's my pleasure to introduce Assistant Commissioner Ken Cobb.
Thank you, Commissioner. And again, welcome to the Department of Records and Information Services and our special program this evening about the CETA program. Now, I was asked to explain why we're here. I mean, it's for the program, obviously, but why are we here in this municipal office? Wasn't CETA a federal program? Well, for the answer, like a lot of things in this life, we have to follow the money. Yes, CETA was federal, but the funding was channeled through local entities. In New York City, that meant the Cultural Council Foundation, a nonprofit which implemented the program with the city's Department of Employment. More about that in a minute. So, there's the money. But how did CETA records wind up at the Municipal Archives? One reason is because in 1980, with Ellin Burke here, then the archivist of the Cultural Council Foundation, and yes, we were teenagers at the time, Ellin called and said she had about 16 boxes of CETA-related records, and did we want them? Now, Ellin knew us because we were a CCF client in those days. They served as a fiscal agent on several of our grant projects. We said yes, we wanted the records. We saw in the CETA program the same historical value as we did in our collection of WPA records from the 1930s. And we also knew about CETA because CETA actually funded several municipal archive staff in the 1970s. Now, back to the Department of Employment. employment for a minute. As I said, they worked with the CCF to administer the CETA funding. In 2008, the Department of Employment let us know they had CCF CETA records that were up for disposal, as they say around here. So archivists took a look and said, like the records we took directly from CCF, that they had historical value and belonged in the archives. So that happened. Another 54 cubic feet of records came to archives. Great stuff. Now, speaking of great stuff, I also want to mention that our Municipal Reference Library, which is in the next room, also has CETA-related publications. But now the real reason we are here is to meet Molly Garfinkel and the other panelists to learn all about CETA. So, Molly is co-director of City Lore and has been researching CETA Arts since 2017. Molly, thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I want to first give a very special thanks to Commissioner Toole and Assistant Commissioner Cobb, who you just heard from, and also the Department of Records and Information Services Reference Service Team, including and especially Katie Ehrlich, who's an archivist, Dwight Johnson and Rosie Mendez, who have worked tirelessly with us on this project here. I've actually been working with them in this very room for over 12 years on myriad projects, so this really feels almost like a second home to me. I want to thank the folks from the digital programs who actually made this PowerPoint and the exhibit that we're going to be talking about and all of these materials digitally accessible to us. Yanni Aviles and Latanya Jones from External Affairs, who've been helping us put this program together. And I just wanted to let you all know that just a few days ago on October 6th, the Mayor's Office presented the Annual Excellence in Customer Service Awards, which is an award presented to individuals and teams from city agencies that exemplify customer service values of respect, timeliness, and quality, including to the DORIS staff, to the reference service team. And I think that really tracks with my experience working with them. They have been just so wonderful, as I said, for 12 years, but especially working on this project. And one of the things that I really wanted to showcase is that they helped in about, I would say 15 days, digitize of the, I think now 72 boxes that are in the collection, materials that we used in an exhibition that I co-curated with the Director of Artists Alliance in Jody Weinberg, called Artwork, How the Government-Funded CETA Program Put Artists to Work, which was located at both City Lore Gallery and Kuchifuta's The AAI Gallery in Essex Market from December 2021 to March 2022. And it was a project that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rubin Foundation, the Kertész Foundation, the Doris Duke Foundation, and was presented in partnership with Creators Rebuild New York. And this completely and totally relied on the collections of the municipal archives, as well as the memories and collections of the folks sitting here at this table this evening. And we wanted to just make sure that we represented the archives and the documentation unit, which is really what this group represents in the exhibit itself, our great appreciation for helping the exhibit happen, not only in 2021 and the research leading up to it, but the creation of the collection to begin with. The 72 boxes that are available now for any researcher to come in and go through it, and they're packed to the gills, there's tons of great stuff in them. All of that was created and collected by the 5 people that you're seeing here and a few others who aren't able to join us today. So just taking a quick step back, what was CETA? Quick facts. CETA stands for the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which was enacted in 1973 in response to recession, rising inflation, and unemployment. Sound familiar? Sort of conditions that we're experiencing right this very minute. Unlike the WPA, to which it's commonly compared, it was decentralized, so that meant funding went to the cities and states, just as Ken stated. And also, unlike the WPA, it was not intended to employ artists. Very specifically, that was not ever in the imagination of the folks who created the CETA legislation. However, thanks to the ingenious creativity of the arts community across the country, over 20,000 artists and cultural workers of all stripes, including archivists, it sounds like, including artists, including venue security staff, archaeologists, anything you could imagine, administrators, were employed through CETA as a job. And again, important, this is not a grant, this was a job opportunity, a training and jobs program. And most, if not all, of the arts programs utilized Title VI, which was for public service employment, so putting artists in community and public spaces. At its peak, CETA invested $20 million a year, which is about $800 million federal legislation to support artists. It started in San Francisco in 1974. It was actually pretty interesting because the brainchild of a gentleman named John Kreidler, who had worked in DC for the Federal Department of Labor and the Office of Management and Budget, and took this idea back to San Francisco, where the San Francisco Art Commission was actually being run by a former WPA easel painter. So they sort of understood innately how this kind of legislation could support artists. And from there, it spread like wildfire, including to New York, which was actually one of the latest programs to come online, but also one of the largest. And as Ken said, it was run by the Cultural Council Foundation. When this was approved in 1977, they had about 3 months to get it all together. And it was inaugurated in January 1978 with 300 artists, so really it was the largest of the arts programs, but also the largest community-based organization under CETA contract, arts or otherwise. And it was, CCF actually directly administered 131 literary, performing, and visual artists, and then had 6 subcontractors, the Association of American Dance Companies, 7, Brooklyn Philharmonia, Association of Hispanic Arts, Black Theater Alliance, Foundation for Independent Video and Film, and the Foundation for the Community of Artists. And so I got invested in this in 2017 because there was just so much great material, including a feature-length documentary called The Federal Artist. I think Mark Levin, who is the producer of that film, is here in the audience today. There's tons of material in the archives. And we had a reunion at City Lore in 2018 because I was like, well, I think this is interesting. I'm a researcher, but is this important for the people who lived it? And the answer was yes, a resounding yes. And then we have documenters going to document, George Malave from the documentation unit documenting this reunion for us for today. And of course, we have the memories and the experience of all of the people to help enrich the documents that live in the archives. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening, who really are the people who made this collection possible, who made our exhibition possible, who are helping to restore and revive the legacy of CETA for the arts, which is just, as I say, so important as a parallel to the conditions that we're experiencing right now. So we have Ellin Burke, the archivist of the CCF CCF Artist Project, George Malave, one of the photographers in the documentation unit, Virginia Maksymowicz, a visual artist and current archivist for the legacy of CETA Arts also across the country, Blaise Tobia, a documentation unit photographer, and Judd Tully, one of the writers on the documentation unit. And it's important for me to know before we go further that the documentation unit, what was the documentation unit? It was a unit dedicated to documenting the program, which is very unique amongst the CETA Arts programs that exist across the country. But before I tell you anymore, Ellin, you want to kick us off? What was the documentation unit?
Okay, first thing I want to say is that my memory is not great, so jump in at any time. The documentation unit was put together because Shelley Slovin and Sarah realized that, like the WPA, we needed to have information for the future and for history. And part of the interest for me was that my very first museum job was the New York Historical Society, and they did have a fairly large WPA collection that I was able to go through. So I knew a lot about the WPA when I started. So we had a few meetings and we were trying to figure out how to do this. And we came across the idea of basically doing interviews with the artists and getting their stories, how did they become artists, how did they get involved in the project, etc., what their goals were. And at the same time, photographing both them and the works that they were producing, and the works that they produced on their own. And the thing that's really interesting about especially the visual artists, but most of the artists, was that there were 2 sort of categories of art that you produce. One was public. You had to do something that was assigned to you by the administrators. You had to go to a school, you had to go to a nursing home, you had to put on a public performance, you had to do a mural. But the other thing was you were supposed to have a certain amount of time to work on your own project. So it was a dual thing, and it was really helpful, I think, for the artists to understand that. It was a jobs program, and they did have a need to produce for the government And certainly there were many parts of the government at that time that really wanted that in it. So that was part of it. And so we were trying to show that we could do really important things in New York. We could help the community, we could help the artistic community, and we could get paid for it. So that was what it was.
If I could just add for a moment, not only were they concerned about the future and the historic legacy of the project, but they were concerned about informing the city what we were doing, and they were concerned about informing ourselves what we were all doing, because we're a big project doing many, many things. So not only did they have a documentation unit, they had an internal newsletter every month. We had meetings every month that exchanged information. So I think our administrators were very, very savvy about making sure things were shared and documented.
Oh, I just want to add one thing too also, because you did mention it. This documentation unit was one part of it, but Mark did head up the video documentation unit, which went around to all the artists, just like you guys did, and videotaped them and interviewed them, and produced a film at the end of it called The Federal Artist, which was on PBS at the time. And I'm not sure how to see it now. I should have asked that before we came, but we'll get that information to see if it is possible to see it now.
You can see it on YouTube, on City Lore's YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay.
So we've talked a little bit about overview of what the documentation unit was, and I'm really glad that Ellin mentioned the studio portraits, which I also think are just a really fascinating part of this. They show a very unique and very personal aspect of this program. George, can I ask you to kick us off in talking a little bit about the studio portraits?
I came onto the project with the idea that I was going to be photographing history, and because I felt it was a historical program in keeping with the WPA and Farm Security Administration, something I was familiar with. And before I came onto the project, I had worked as in a studio photographing archives for museums and galleries. So I understood the importance of documenting a program. And archives are a way of us keeping track of our development. And they're not dead things, they're just, I find that archives are a storehouse of knowledge waiting for the right person to come along and use them. At the time, I was interested in photographing artists in their environments. So when CETA came along, to me, I hit the lottery. I said, I'm given the opportunity now to work with 300 artists, interview them, visit their studios, photograph them, and to me, that was an ideal situation based on my background. And it turned out to be that. It turned out to be a life-changing experience, I think, for most of us. And not only were we doing something we loved, that we were good at, we were being paid to do it. And so the portraits, I think, are important because what we do as humans are people. You know, we deal and create things, and people do them. So to have a record of who made them, their backgrounds, their faces, I think is important historically. And I'm always inspired by other artists, and not only what they look like, but what they do and how they do it. And that was all part of the documentary unit. And I also found that I enjoyed working with the group themselves. I think we worked pretty well together. I don't remember one conflict we had. We all selected what we found to be of interest to us, and if anybody had a conflict, it was easily resolved. And I found that I enjoyed photographing artists, so I went out of my way to photograph as many as I could. And I think it's paid off, and it's created a decent body of work that now has a new life.
And I think it's important, again, just to really to underscore, in case we're not getting the message across, that this was work, this was a job. And so you were photographing the artists in their places of work, which was both in the community and in their studios, in the places where they make, where they create, where they inspire us to be, more civic-minded, to be movement builders, to be thinkers, to be feelers. And so that duality, I think, was really important, and to respect the artists as people. These, not just as workers, but as people with inspirations who would down the line inspire other people. And speaking of work, one of the things that's really great, just in case I haven't mentioned how great this archive is yet, is that it includes all kinds of material. And so this is actually, for me, this was like one of the best things to find. This is the letter from the Department of Employment to CCF announcing that the project was approved after many years of having to really drum up interest, drum up political support, sort of organize the arts community in New York, which, as you can imagine, is no small feat, to get the funding to the artists. There had already been CETA funding in New York City, but it hadn't been given to artists. So in 1977, this is August 5th, they had to get this launched by the very beginning of 1978. So really build this infrastructure, build the plane while they're flying it. And documenting, even before there was a documentation unit, documenting how wild this process was and how unique an opportunity this was. This was actually photographed, this is the artist applying, so before the project even got off the ground, this is the father-in-law of the executive director of the CCF who took this photo. And it's all kinds of material, from news pieces celebrating the program, to lists, to letters, to the process of what this meant for the community. And I, again, want to note, these are really not small press and publication opportunities. The New York Times featured this prominently, frequently. Listings of the programs and the output that the artists were producing, posters and event flyers, all kinds of ephemera. Also beautiful books that are actually in the Sunset Park location, the Industry City location of the Municipal Archives that we looked at in October. Internal communication, and then also a ton of documentation about the administration. So it was documenting all aspects of the program, and it really shows that this was a labor of love, but it was a complex organism that created this opportunity. Ellin, do you want to speak to that, or somebody want to kick off thinking about documenting the administration and working with them?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to remember. What we decided was we were going to have 3 writers and 3 photographers, and part of the issue was trying to actually program these people to get to every single artist in the project. And actually, I think that was one of the best parts of it for you guys. I didn't get a chance to do it, but you guys met every single artist in the project. So I think that was a lot of fun, and it was really great. And so organizing this and organizing it in a way where we would cover everything, and yet the writers and the photographers could work with the kinds of artists who interested them, and people who interested them. And then there was the issue of how we get the material, how do the photographs get printed, how do the audio tapes get typed out, and it was really complex. And truthfully, I just remember sitting at my desk every day with boxes and boxes of stuff in front of me, making lists. I had so many lists, and George says he remembers a list of the assignment lists, but those weren't the only lists. There were a lot of lists. And we had to report to CCF. And the CCF had to report to the government. We had to keep timesheets, which a lot of artists didn't want to do. And we had to just show people that we were actually producing. And this unit was the major way that we showed people how we were producing.
I just wanted to add something here, which is, you were talking about the administration, Molly. It was a fairly large administrative group given the size of the project. And normally, in life, I would criticize programs that put too much money into administration. But in the case of CCF, it was very well thought out and very well spent. And we've learned in retrospect that our administrators did a terrific job because they had to find community sponsors, they had to find artists, they had to match us with the community sponsors, they had to ride herd over all this and troubleshoot where necessary. I mean, they did a huge, huge amount of work. And most of them themselves were artists, so they were pretty well tuned in to both our needs and what the community needs were.
And I think that, thanks so much for saying that, Blaise, because I think that's really important. And there's some letters behind the panelists this evening which represent an absolute minuscule fraction of the letters of thanks and support and appreciation from community placements of all varieties. I can't even begin to describe how many different types of placements the artists were in, which we'll look at in a little bit, but also letters from the artist to the administration and back and forth. And you can really see the love and affection and care from both sides. And I just always loved this letter from Kasia Berman, who is a late writer who was in the literary pool, who writes sort of at the beginning of the program, September 1978, sort of talking about how she was not satisfied with her work before CETA, but saying that that's changing now. And I think that the reason for the subject matter of most of my poems is that was all that was happening in my life, and now that's changing. The whole subject of work and how it relates to the person one is one of the most complex. I've been blooming this year, slowly, sometimes painfully, but blooming nevertheless, because I have a place now to give what I have, and the more I've been giving, the more I've been having. I wonder if the country would be like, what would the country would be like if this was a general working condition? And I think that really nicely encapsulates the amount of effort and the amount of thought and the amount of care that was given by every member of the CCF, the administration and the artists, and everyone in between. So speaking of sort of mentorship, so between the artists and the administration and back, it was also really interesting that this program, which had a large number of younger artists while it was operating, also had a pretty significant number of senior artists, including a number of former WPA artists. And I think this photograph is really interesting because what we see here, this is at one of the artist meetings, this is Daoud Bey, who many of you might know, a pretty well-known photographer, in the back with the beret. You have Hans Slonim, also a fairly well-known painter. Joe Giordano, who was in the administration of CCF, who went on to become a professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and Art Guerra, who unfortunately recently passed away, who was also a visual artist in the program and then went on to create his own line of pigments and had a store in the East Village for many, many, many years, just until very recently. Hopefully they're moving to a new location. But these folks were all here and were mentored by older artists, but have gone on to become major mentors for artists in this generation. I just think that's really an important thing to point out. So Judd, can you talk a little bit about working with some of these older artists?
Sure. Well, two that the most significant ones in the program, as far as I recall, were both painters, Joseph Delaney and Herman Cherry, and both of those gentlemen actually worked in the WPA. So this was in 1978, so they were no longer youngsters, and both had pretty difficult times surviving. And through both Joe, whose older brother Buford Delaney is one of the most acclaimed 20th century painters, significant museum exhibitions. Joe Delaney, who was, and Buford became an expatriate, lived in Paris, was good friends with James Baldwin. Herman Miller wrote a chapbook on Buford Delaney when he was living on Green Street, etc. And Joe, who was younger, went to the Art Students League every day during, until they were both from Knoxville, and late in his life Joe went down to Knoxville. The university there set him up in some kind of artist program, which he absolutely hated. But anyway, Joe probably went to the Art Students League because of the nude models, and as he always talked about, he loved women. But this guy lived in a Union Square studio, Union Square West, and in just the most Spartan conditions imaginable. And he later saved his brother's work after his brother died in Paris. Was in a mental institution. And okay, so not to go on too much there. Herman Cherry introduced me because he had a terrible memory, and he kept saying when I was interviewing him, I don't remember so-and-so's name, but if you call Dorothy Daner, she will tell you the whole story. Dorothy Daner, very significant sculptor, was the first wife of David Smith. She's had exhibitions, and she's long passed. And there was a whole group of people. So as a young person, hearing these stories about the 1930s was pretty exciting. And one of the artists in this group, Reuben Kadish, he and Philip Guston went to Mexico and painted a mural. And anyway, it just introduced me to a huge body of information. And I became good friends with a number of these older artists. And so I want to mention one other artist who's lesser known. Well, actually, posthumously, he's getting much better known, is Vincent Smith. African-American artist like Joe Delaney, very much influenced by Romare Bearden, longtime Brooklyn resident, went to all the jazz clubs, was a beautiful, expressionist, figurative painter, and just recently having big exhibitions in New York. Anyway, so that was a real jumping off point for me in terms of continuing onwards post CETA Artist Project with these artists and working with them.
Judd actually brings up a good point about the WPA artists, but what's more interesting, at least to me, is Joe Delaney and Herman Cherry represent the vast width and breadth of the artists that were in the project. Herman Cherry was an abstract expressionist. He did geometric painting. Joe Delaney, who was inspired by Romare Bearden and some of the artists of that, was figurative. And the idea that there were so many different varied kinds of artists who did so many different varied kinds of things, even within the same structure as painting, I thought was fascinating. And I think, to your point about the administration, I think that is a really great example of how the administration worked really hard to find interesting, good artists of all scopes. You had tap dancers, you had ballet dancers, you had Japanese Noh dancers, you had poets, you had writers, you had all kinds of artists, and there was no sort of rule about what kind of art you did. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you for mentioning that. So speaking of which, the previous slide was of Laji Kamara, who is also known as Papa Laji, who's more or less introduced African drumming in a very big way to New York City. City Law recently did a program with a number of artists who he mentored during his life, but he was a very significant figure in West African drumming. And Charles Cookie Cook, who was a member of the Copacetics, who was a very established tap dancer at the time, was a mentor to Jane Goldberg, who was an up-and-coming tap dancer. And I think it's also worth mentioning that through the program, artists and administrators also got to engage with, the very recently independent agency of the Department of Cultural Affairs, which really had become its own separate entity about the year before this program got off the ground. Previously it had been, I think, in the same umbrella with Parks and Rec and maybe one other agency. And so the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, Henry Geldzeller, as I understand it, was majorly supportive of this program and spent a lot of time with the artists and encouraged many people. So thinking about expansion and the opportunity to be mentored and to then become a mentor, one of the great things about this very big cohort is that it put a lot of people in contact who may never have come into contact because they worked in different disciplines, because they worked in disparate studios across the city, and then to meet people outside of CCF as well. So Blaise, I was actually wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, or George or anybody else about collaborating within the program and beyond.
Well, I do have to say, Ellen, that the program was a revelation to me. Right. Virginia and I had just gotten out of graduate school in California, come back to New York, and we were in a very academic, very, I would have to say, white environment, and suddenly we were thrown, and very young environment, and we were thrown into the most racially, age-wise, gender-wise, style-wise universe we had ever seen, because this project had really made a major effort to do all those things. To select people in such a way as to represent every sort of diversity, including the geographical diversity of the city, right? And that was partly because it was had to follow the Department of Labor rules, which a lot of art projects don't have to do, but also it was really the desire of the people who created the project to do that. So for me, it was just this glorious postdoc of a sort, in which I got to meet people and talk to people and make friends with people that I never would have just bumped up against, and travel to all kinds of parts of the city that I never would have gone to. And it was absolutely invaluable. Plus it taught me the discipline of having to make good pictures always and regularly and deliver them on time, which is not something you had to do as an art student. So in that sense,
And so what we're looking at now are some larger collaborative opportunities that the CCF helped to create, but which were really, implemented by the artists in the program, including Artists by the Sea, which was a month-long festival in Snug Harbor and Staten Island, and there was also a multidisciplinary program called Inner Space, Outer Space by sort of curated by one of the artists in the program, Ellsworth Osby, and which included many disciplines also that got to perform at Union Square and then in Osby's apartment and then at the Museum of Natural History. So there was really just a tremendous opportunity for collaboration within the program and then to be collaborating with institutions and outside of institutions across the city.
I think you just mentioned Ellsworth Osby, and in terms of collaboration, in terms of the way things work from the late 70s to just very recently, Ellsworth, who no longer, he passed away, and recently there was a major exhibition of his paintings at the Eric Firestone Gallery in NoHo, and anyway, I connected Blaise here with the gallery. I think I've got that right. And Blaise had these amazing installation photographs of Ellsworth's studio in Williamsburg that they used and produced this in the catalog. And it showed not only a collaboration at the time with Blaise and Ellsworth, and getting that kind of personal, going into someone's studio and showing your work, and then fast forward with our kind of mini collaboration connection, which happens a lot over the years, has happened a lot over the years, which I'm sure everyone could,
Yeah, I found that I made everyone in the project my teacher. And I love working with the group. I remember going out with Judd, and I learned that he could easily get somebody to talk. He would just give them a very concise, well-focused question, and let that person run with it. And the stories would just pour out of them. And so I learned how to use that when I did portraits. I found that it was very helpful to have a person relax. And you do that not just by pointing a camera at him, but first just sit down, talk, find out what their interests are, what they do, how they do it. And that was part of the learning process that went on all the time with each artist. You know, there were artists who, I think Banerjee would paint with smoke. I said, what? I said, paint with smoke? Yeah, and then he said, okay, let me show you. So he lit up, he lit something up and turned the canvas upside down and started painting with it. I said, wow, I never saw that before. So it was a daily learning process throughout 2 years. Yeah. And also it was a learning process dealing with the sponsors.
So community, actually, would you say more about that with the community placements?
Because we were part of the team, we stuck together for about 2 years, and I think maybe a couple of months after that, I had to go out and find a sponsor. Rather than they finding a sponsor, I said, I see what everybody's doing, so I approached the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, something I knew about since I was a child. And I said, let me see if they were interested in having a photographer help them in promoting their garden. And they came, I went and had an interview. They said, great. So I said, all you gotta do is pay for the film and the processing, and our salaries will be taken care of. And they just let me go. And for 6 months, I photographed the gardens. They used it in their promotions, in their annual report, in postcards. And then after the program, I wanted to complete the seasons. So I said, would you be open for me to come back and photograph the seasons? They said, sure. So I have a whole series of them, of the entire year of the garden. So that was a part of collaborating in a different way.
Can I say just one thing? Again, going backwards, forwards in time, and you mentioning Banerjee and his amazing process. And right now at MoMA, it's I think it's officially open, the exhibition called Just Above Midtown, which was a gallery, pretty much artist-run gallery that was founded by Linda Good Bryant. And there's an exhibition right now at MoMA, and there were Dawood Bey, who you saw before with the beret. Some of his photographs are in the exhibition. Banerjee is in the exhibition. A photographer, Nina Kuo, who is also CETA artist. Willie Bird.
Londale Cummings.
Londale Cummings. Go ahead.
George Mako. And CETA artists from California.
Yeah. So it's just sort of, and interestingly, JAM, which was many artists of color, including the founder, which was quite radical at the time. We're talking about 1974, and it ran for about maybe a dozen years in 3 different locations. But it was a different, it wasn't the art world of, Christie's, art fairs. It wasn't about money, really. It was about making art and communication in a community.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but I haven't said anything yet because I was not on the documentation team. But picking up on collaboration, many times we got assignments from the administrators that put us in groups to work on something. So speaking of Banerjee, he was part of the group that I worked with at the Brooklyn Arts and Cultural Center to literally make Baca downtown. What I mean by literally is we were scraping wallpaper off, building stages, painting the walls, and painting murals. So that was a learning experience too, and you had older artists and younger artists working together.
And sorry, we flipped through some of those earlier. There beautiful photographs. It was really amazing what was done, and what you see sort of at the apotheosis of that, which is not the apotheosis itself was the center, but Sue Scher, who was a paper artist, is a paper artist based in Alaska now, and Joan Mondale presenting a book to Joan Mondale as part of a multidisciplinary, multi-CCF CETA artist show that Sue and others helped to curate at called The Naked Book at Baca Downtown, which is just a really stunning example of collaborations, of expansions, of making connections, of learning from mentors. Joan Mondale, also known as Joan of Art, because she was just such a major supporter of the arts. So thinking about communities and communication, that was a big part of this program. And sort of the other maybe 50% or a third of this program was community placements. And as George was talking about sponsorship, one of the things that the administration had to do was help to find placements, to vet placements for the artists to do this public service employment. And at some point also divided the group, the cohort into teams, sort of to demonstrate what artists can do as workers in the public. And through this program, you all had opportunities to work in every single corner of the city with communities of every description, working with all kinds of challenges, with all kinds of opportunities. And I imagine learned a lot, and that the communities learned a lot from having artists placed in these contexts, which were not just arts contexts. They were hospitals, senior centers, daycare centers, schools, correctional facilities, parks, etc., and on and on. Does somebody want to speak to that learning opportunity with the city, with communities in the city?
Well, something I'll pick up on is that sometimes the assignments were not perfect, all right? And actually this can be seen in the archive, because in the 54, 55 boxes of the paper archives, there are back and forths between the administrators and the artists and the community groups. Because sometimes the groups didn't understand what it meant to commit to producing an artwork, for example. But on the other hand, there were other assignments, for example, that I had, where, in fact, I think maybe this is the letter from Rosita Enriquez, which was fabulous. It was at a school district in the Bronx, and we worked with the students, the parents got involved, we had, Enfoco Gallery got involved with us, and at the end, the parents wound up cooking all this food for a party, and it was fabulous. So it really ranged in terms of the interactions with the communities, and the administrators were the ones who sort of ran interference and made it work.
George mentioned doing a lot of work for the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. After the documentation unit kind of rolled up, my first community assignment was for the Richmond Hill Historical Society, which wanted a document of the historical buildings in Richmond Hill, which they are still using on their website today. So that certainly was a resource that has been valuable to them.
Wasn't Jane Warner's paintings part of that also? So it was the photography, Anna Warner. It was the photography, and then there was a realist painter named Anna Warner who went out and actually painted a lot of the historic buildings in that neighborhood. So it was a real mixed media.
But I have this quite distinct memory of Anna Warner, right? And this was in Ridgewood, which is right on the Queens-Brooklyn borderline. Then it was like German, American, all these old breweries, brick buildings. And she was very petite, and she was standing in the middle of the street with her easel, painting a building, and I went with Sarah Wells, who was the third photographer on the documentation team, which she's since passed. And we went and interviewed her, and I mean, the community or people, would like stop and say, what are you doing? Like, why are you painting a building? And now, today, that neighborhood is like super on the road to heavy-duty gentrification, tons of young people, anyway.
I think it's also worth noting that this is in the context of 1978, so 1977, 78, 1975. The New York City is basically on the brink of bankruptcy. All kinds of services are being cut from communities. Garbage removal, landlords are burning their buildings down to get collect insurance money. We've got police and other sort of safety being, just sort of divested from, especially communities of color, outer borough communities. And among the things that are being cut, of course, are art services. So in very many ways, this filled a huge gap in services that the city couldn't provide, wouldn't provide. And so this was not just, and one of the things Ellin has said about the archive is proving that the arts are not just icing on the cake. this wasn't icing on the cake. This was critical services for these communities who otherwise would not have had access to. And I wanted to, I love this photograph. When you see that in color, it really sort of brings it all to like Technicolor. And thinking about, just to go back to the MediaWorks team, to embarrass Mark Levin back there, sorry Mark, the MediaWorks got really involved with one of the unions, the 1199 Healthcare Workers Union, and created a beautiful documentary, which we are screening on October 22nd at the Puffin Cultural Forum in Teaneck, New Jersey at 4 p.m. This is about the Bread and Roses program of this 1199 Healthcare Union. It was a cultural program putting artists, actors, performers, visual artists, historians in the context where healthcare workers were working to provide levity, to provide beauty, but also to collect oral histories and to reflect their experience back to them, and also to help use that as an organizing tool for the healthcare workers who were trying to organize to save a lot of these community hospitals, which at this time were under threat of being eliminated because of all these budget cuts, and in many cases, which the documentary shows, were successful. So it's not just icing on the cake. It's inspiration, it's movement building. And I think a lot of what the artists here got to do was be part of that, very much from the ground up, and be in all these different kinds of contexts and influence politics, including at City Hall. I think this was the first art exhibition in either a very long time at City Hall that Mayor Ed Koch, as you can see, is enjoying immensely. And I think the politics around this moment were really critical for everybody at this table, so both internally and externally. So moving ahead to thinking about that, so the CCF program, as we mentioned, was one of the last to come into being of the CETA Arts programs because it took so long to sort of organize, but already by the time it got off the ground in 1978, CETA, the legislation, was under fire on a national level. There were allegations of misuse of funds, of lack of oversight, sort of lack of metrics. Does that sound familiar? To measure what the impact of a lot of these programs were, partially because it was decentralized and there was no sort of unifying standard of measurement against which to evaluate these programs. And of course, the arts were an easy target. So even from the beginning, one of the things that the CCF archive collects is this criticism and having to work very, very hard to surpass expectations, to really prove the importance of giving funding at all, but CETA funding to the artists. And so very early on, this group, which basically had just come into being, had to activate and protest and organize to save the program. Does anybody want to talk about some of that?
Yeah. First off, let me just back up a second. I wanted to say this a while ago, Molly. One thing interesting about this program is you had to prove need, right? You had to show you really had a very low income the year before the program, but at the same time, you had to be interviewed, you had to audition, you had to go before a professional panel. So it was this weird kind of hybrid of being kind of social support, but also requiring very high performance levels, as an artist. And I think a lot of bureaucrats did not realize that, for one thing, in terms of the criticism. But as Molly is saying, we were only about 6 or 7 months into this project when we artists began to realize there was no guarantee it was going to continue for a second year. It had only been contracted for 1 year, right? And partly the foresight of our administrators was to build a great case as to why it should be continued, to do the metrics. But we knew that we had to kind of help out from our side. So we right away created a union, essentially, the CETA Artists Organization, which began to meet and began to have demonstrations and began to, such as one in City Hall, and began to push for renewal of the CETA contract for CCF. And in fact, that succeeded very well. And in fact, the metrics were so good that we got an extra 25 artists for the second year of the program. But then we began to realize that all of CETA was under risk. So in 1979, we also became aware we were part of a much larger thing, with millions of other people working through CETA, not artists. And so we allied with a much larger group of CETA unions, basically, and began to have demonstrations in mid-1979 to protest for the continuation of CETA. And CETA did just barely squeak by and continue into 1980, but by early 1980, it was again under threat. And the city was threatening to basically terminate the contracts. So in mid-1980, there was yet another series of demonstrations where it was the artists and the administrators who showed up on the street to protest for continuation. So yeah, we all realized we had a great thing, and while we were providing a very good service to the city, we also wanted it to continue and organized around it.
And I want to just point out, important to note that in the previous slide, the rally was all CETA workers, including artists, and it's listed in there. And I think that's just a really important, very small detail, but an important visual for understanding artists as understood as part of the labor force. And even as this is happening, even as there's criticism sort of on a national level, at the national level and the local level, there are people who are trying to make a case for CETA arts programs to continue to grow, to begin in places across the country, including the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Ernest Green, who was really instrumental in creating a series of workshops called Putting the Arts to Work in a series of cities around the country in 1979, basically at the exact moment as those protests, Blaise photos just before, trying to push momentum for this to continue. So it was really coalition building at every single possible level that the artists and the administrators were doing. And you can see here, despite cuts, U.S. hopes to expand the CETA Arts. Here's a booklet, this giant binder that was created for the Putting the Arts to Work workshop, which is in the collection here. And despite that, as Blaise said, the news came down that this program was going to be eliminated in 1980. And again, it's not an insignificant thing on all fronts. You know, the New York Times is reporting on this. And in the meantime, they've got trying to sort of help phase the artists phase them out of the program and into the market, which we'll talk about in a second. But to do that, the support that they created was in the form of something called the Job Development Unit, which was supposed to interview artists, create workshops for them for exiting out, to try to create placements, to try to really help people get some of their resumes and their portfolios in shape, to provide that really concentrated support, because this was happening, but they weren't going to just let them out there, without any support structure, even while they're pounding the pavement to continue to try to keep the project from shutting down early, to rally with the artists. This is I love this photo, in 1980, but they thought the project was going to shut down with like 15 days to go. There's the administration. And they had local support in the form of Ted Weiss, who was a local legislator, a congressman who actually proposed legislation that never got off the ground based on the CETA Artist Program. So, and then you can see in the archives that there was just this tremendous love and appreciation on the part of the artists for all the work that was done and all the support that they provided, which was really one of my favorite parts, as I said. And then, speaking of
Molly, they even coached us on how to apply for unemployment insurance.
Important, not an insignificant thing.
Because many of us didn't know we'd be eligible. We didn't know about being laid off.
So Virginia, you want to talk a little bit about activating as an activist?
Yeah, well, something, Molly's question about sort of becoming activists after CETA. I think a combination of being part of these collaborative artist groups and meeting a lot of artists, and then learning how to organize through the CETA Artists Organization. In the 1980s, a lot of the political artist groups grew out of the CETA connections. So, for example, a bunch of us from CCF became part of Art Against Apartheid. And I know ones I could remember off the top of my head: Blaise and I, Susan Ortega, Willie Birch, Nina Quo, Dawood Bey, Sandra Esteves, Candida Alvarez. I bet there were more. Others were involved in artist call against U.S. intervention in Central America, and I found a document that showed that Jane Goldberg was part of that, and so were two of the poets on our project, Charles Bernstein and Bob Holman. And again, maybe there are more. Blaise and I went on to work for the Foundation of the Community of Artists, where the documentation unit had been housed. And remember, I wasn't on the documentation unit, but we went back to FCA as editors for the newspaper, Art and Artists. And FCA was a sponsor of Art Against Apartheid, and on the newspaper, we regularly interacted with CETA artists about projects they were doing with these political groups. There was a lot of overlap, and many of us crossed over also with political art documentation, distribution, known as PAD. It was just interesting to see that segue into the 80s. So sometimes I have trouble remember who I worked with on CETA and who I worked with at FCA and who I worked with in Art Against Apartheid, because a lot of it was the same people.
I just wanted to bringing that up, that whole thing about whether we were going to continue the project, actually really impacted the archive and the art group, because at a certain point, I remember getting calls from CCF and from Shelley Slogan. We need to show them what we're doing. Can you put together a group of photographs and a group of interviews with these people, show them in the community? So the archive actually, besides documenting it for historical purposes, sort of became the propaganda unit of CCF, and that was really great. I was really happy to do that.
Thanks for that, Ellin. Propaganda unit, I'm going to use that in my next thinking. So very quickly, I want to just give Virginia opportunity to talk about the archiving work that you're doing now around restoring and sort of reviving this legacy.
All right. We have something now called the CETA Arts Legacy project, and it actually began as a small group of artists that I'd say the first time we tried was, the 10th anniversary, then the 20th anniversary, the 30th anniversary. Finally, around the 40th anniversary, we started to pick up some speed. And we wanted to document the project because we recognized it as just important in terms of history, that this thing happened, it was good, people should know about it. But especially once the pandemic hit, we realized that knowledge of a program like CETA slipping away was not going to help artists in the future, right? And I love this quote from Ted Berger, who's the former executive director of the New York Foundation for the Arts, but he was also one of the designers of the CETA Artists Project. He said, this history is important so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every time the cultural sector faces a crisis. So, what did we do? We put together a website with that in mind, and we actually have a page that talks about CETA being a model for today. Over the course of the shutdown, when we were doing everything online, our coalition grew to be nationwide. We have artists, administrators, academics, and government officials, some of them who were involved with the arts and CETA. Besides the website, we've posted a Wikipedia article, we've published written articles, we've consulted with administrators designing new artist employment projects, such as Creatives Rebuild New York, which was already mentioned, Artists at Work, upstate New York. We've endorsed legislation such as the Bipartisan Creative Economy Revitalization Act, which is a bill introduced in the Congress by Representatives Leger Fernandez and Obernolte. We put forth CETA as a model for funding the arts in the 21st century, writing an article for the College Art Association's initiative Beyond Survival, funding for the arts and humanities. We offered it as a case study for former Mayor de Blasio's cultural plan, Create New York, And we contributed to American for the Arts proposal for putting creative workers to work. As you already know, we've partnered with City Law and with the Artists Alliance, and also the Delaware Art Museum. And they are involved in producing exhibitions, sponsoring panel discussions like this, and also archiving CETA Arts documentation. We've also partnered with Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, which I'm now Professor Emerita from there. We've partnered with their library to create an open access online digital archive via Google Drive. It can be accessed from anywhere on the planet that can get on the internet. It's grown exponentially over the past 3 years. It's updated regularly, contains videos, Zoom recordings, scans of documents, artist testimonials, government reports, academic papers, both for the New York project and nationwide. And I know Molly has some slides going, and you can see there are folders for every state that we find stuff for. And more stuff has been coming up online. And we also, for the New York City project, of course, have a folder directing users to the materials at this archive at DORIS. And I've got to put in a plug for the staff at DORIS here. Not only did they arrange for us, or you arranged for us, to be among the first to access the new Industry City location and to plow through all those boxes of photographs and to get everything scanned. But during the pandemic shutdown in 2020, they hosted an artist in residence named Julia Wiest. And if you Google her, you'll find a very interesting website. She actually used documentation of the CCF project to produce a series of collages. And these collages for us proved invaluable in helping us locate the photographic archive. So thank you, Julia. W-E-I-S-T, Julia Wiest. And I think the project she did is called Public Record. And however, despite these accomplishments, we still feel a sense of urgency in getting CETA's funding of those 20,000 cultural sector jobs better known. Yes, for researching CETA in the arts, the Municipal Archives, similar archives in other cities, like Chicago actually has a pretty good archive of their project, and the Google Drive archive that F&M hosts undoubtedly contain important records. However, if art historians don't start researching this now, they will lose access to even more important primary sources, the individuals who experienced it. While many of us who are involved as artists and administrators around the country are still alive, we are in our 70s, 80s, and even 90s. And I know Judd referred to this, a number have died, a good number have died. 2 years ago, I received an email from Hans Ulrich Obrist, the director of Serpentine Galleries in London, asking, "What's the best book written about CETA and the arts?" I had to respond to him, there isn't any. No comprehensive art historical book has yet to be written on CETA and the arts. So to that end, we continue to target scholars. And Blaise and I and an art historian from Philadelphia are going to be holding a session at the College Art Association Conference this coming year. And by the way, we had already done 2 other panels at CAA in 2019, and then the pandemic hit. But we're going to be doing another panel aimed at art historians called Art History in Search of a Historian. We hope to find that historian. So if any of you on Zoom, any of you here, know of a historian who wants to research this, the archive is here. There are multiple archives. The Arts Legacy Project can direct you to all sorts of information around the country. Just let us know.
How do you see CETA operating like similarly to other sort of organizations like WAGE, like WAGE, and like NIFA, and you just showed CAA, like they provide resources for artists, maybe in a less centralized way. I wonder what you think about their connections.
I think for us, something that's very important was something we learned from CETA, which was CETA was an overall employment act, right, for everybody. It was not art specific. And also, as Molly's pointed out, it was a job, it was not a grant. And occasionally there was a little bit of tension with some artists who thought the other way around and had to be reminded it was a job and not a grant. But I think it's best to build support for artists in with support for all people who need to work, and just have it be one component, because we are all, after all workers, right? And there are some movements around in the arts community to insist that artists recognize we are all artists. We are not special. We are not the only people who need a job. And I think we need to be part of a larger group that will benefit from any program.
I don't know how many of you are aware of this other movement now called the guaranteed income movement or basic income movement that, Blaise, I think you brought up the pandemic. But the pandemic opened a door to the idea of the federal government giving direct payment to citizens in a time of crisis. And that started or accelerated an idea that's been around for quite a while, this idea of a guaranteed income or basic income. And there's a coalition of, I think, over 100 cities that are piloting guaranteed income programs. And quite a number of them include artists. Now, of course, this is different than an employment program in that most of these programs you get $500 a month, not necessarily enough to live on. California is actually the most generous at $1,000 a month for either 12 months or 18 months. But a lot of these programs, Oakland, St. Paul, a number of them are including artists in the population that they are serving. So that's another way that this idea of kind of integrating artists into a larger place, like what you were saying, a larger group of people that need some help facing financial insecurity can get that help. And in this case, no strings are attached. That's part of it. It's, you can do with the money whatever you want. So just want to make that, as you search for the historian, the idea is re-emerging not just in the arts community, but in the larger community, and there are now over 100 cities that are piloting programs, guaranteed income programs.
Thank you, Mark.
Something I might want to add to that is, I think it was just, for me personally, I found getting paid to be an artist very freeing, meaning I was not concerned about having to have a commercial gallery and make work for the marketplace. Now, it also didn't mean that I was just making work for some esoteric reason that didn't communicate with anybody, because I was hooked up with community groups, and that influenced my personal work too. And I think there's something very freeing about being treated as another worker, that you have a job as an artist and you get paid and you have health insurance and you get vacation. So, I mean, even something with the, like you're saying, Mark, with the minimum guaranteed bottom line security, yeah, that's, if that is instituted, artists should be part of that. But I think the art world has sort of shifted so much to the marketplace right now that it's actually putting a lot of stress on artists, and I think it's detrimental to the development of new ideas in art.
Another question that we sort of wanted to talk about is exactly that, sort of the transition, the harsh transition potentially out from this program, and the idealism of the time, and the sort of community that this created, this support structure, the pluralism of this time into, so just also for reference in the quick facts, in Ronald Reagan became president and then eliminated CETA in 1982, and of course, drastically the culture of the country changed, the economy changed, the market sort of driven orientation was really given a big boost. And I wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts about what it was like for you to transition out from this program into what sounds like this, the same kind of economy that you're talking about, Virginia, right now, sort of a continuation of that, what that experience was like, and if you have any thoughts for young people trying to, become artists right now.
Well, just today I was about this question. It seems like a really long time ago, but Reaganomics took over the country. So 1984, Ronald Reagan, in the biggest landslide of any presidential election, crushed Walter Mondale, whose wife, Joan of Arc. That was, anyway, a connection. But what I remember, I went to this nightclub that was going on, it was on November 4th, 1984, and I know this because a friend of mine organized part of it at Danceteria. But it was this really fun, bizarre, artists, tons of art, dancing. They had a video lounge. Video was very early at that point, relatively speaking. And it was all about Reagan and the, people knowing that the sort of lefty party was over. And I'm not saying that in a cynical way, but it's interesting connecting it to today and the thought of kind of the end of democracy in this country with Trump and the whole 9 yards. And I do miss Danceteria, but that was an interesting time. That transition to whether you maintain friendships with people in the program or you went on separate ways. It was it was not a necessarily smooth transition.
Something else I'd like to add about the hidden history of CETA, and we were not aware of this at the time when we were CETA artists, how many artist-run spaces got CETA money. And this is where that kind of administrative side came in, because sometimes they got administrative money for fundraisers or just administrative assistance. But I mean, everything from the Women's Building in LA to Hall Walls and CETA and the Women's Studio Workshop, and in the archive we have an interview with the woman who ran the Chicago Artists Coalition. And she said virtually every exhibition, nonprofit exhibition space in Chicago had CETA money. So again, in terms of artists, say, and what you do, how you show your work, unlike today where so much is based in the marketplace and commercial galleries, there were a ton of nonprofit spaces. So in terms of Blaise and my transitioning out of the project, we had teaching jobs for a while, then we didn't have teaching jobs, and we office temped, and we did all sorts of things. But we continued to show all over the place because there were all of these spaces. Yes, rents were lower too, but the Women's Studio Workshop in Rosendale had 11 CETA positions. And that helped stabilize a lot of these nonprofits for the next 2 decades.
I think we have to wrap now, unfortunately, but please check out the CETA Arts Legacy project. Please take a look at the Arts Alliance Inc. and City Lore websites under our CETA headings. Please consider coming to next week's screening of Bread and Roses. I can't say how much I love that film. It's beautiful. It's so relevant for everything that we're talking about right now. Made in the 70s, calling healthcare workers essential workers, and seeing that essential artists are put into these contexts with these essential workers working together is really very inspiring and very lesson giving and life giving for what we're looking at here now in 2022. Please check out the websites of the artists who are here. Their bios and profiles should be in the link on Eventbrite and on DORIS. And one more time, please thank very much Ellin, Blaise, Virginia, Judd, and George for being here.